France 24 debate. We're looking at who will stop the violence between Israel and the Gaza Strip. We're talking about it with Dore Gold, president of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, former Israeli ambassador to the United Nations and advisor to Benjamin Netanyahu. From the Gaza Strip, Hani al-Bassous, who teaches at the Islamic University of Gaza, and France 24's very own Annette Young is back with us. Just before we continue, I just want to pick up on the point that was made just before the break by Dore Gold about Hamas employing leverage on Egypt. Hani al-Bassous, your thoughts on that? Do you sense the same thing?
No, I don't think so. I think Hamas was well established in Gaza in 2006 after the election as a legitimate government chosen by the Palestinian people. Then it was under siege. Since that time, the Israeli government launched a war against Gaza in 2008, and then after that, Hamas was committed to a ceasefire. Hamas built itself as a government in Gaza, doing its best to rebuild the Gaza Strip, and it was really committed to the ceasefire, which was violated by the Israeli government many times. What we can see at this moment, the operation, which is still underway right now, was ignited by the assassination of Ahmed al-Jabari, and I think this was a step was taken by Netanyahu government.
But hang on, let's not get into who started it, because we want to go to how it's going to all end.
Yeah, but this is the main point we talk about now. Who can stop firing? I think Hamas is committed to a ceasefire, and it was committed. And Netanyahu government wanted to take a step towards the election in Israel, which is going to be in a few weeks' time, and this was by the assassinating of Ahmed al-Jabari, so he can win more votes. And this has a heavy stake on Hamas, because he's not as any normal leader of Hamas. He's one of the most unique leaders of Hamas, and this has an impact on the whole organization, in which I think Netanyahu should from the beginning understand that such killing would take such consequences, and such an attack on Gaza did not stop since that time. I think Hamas' response.
All right, but please, let's get to the question of that was posed, which is Hamas's leverage with the Egyptian government.
I don't think there is much leverage now, despite the change of position by the Egyptian government, and despite that the Egyptian government is led by Muslim Brotherhood. It's not as expected by the Palestinian people and by Hamas. The visit which was done by Prime Minister Hisham Kandil to Gaza was a symbolic gesture and did not make much for the Palestinian society, in which people still live under fire in Gaza. The situation is becoming more dangerous, and insecurity prevailed in Gaza. Up to now, statements were made by Egypt, and some meetings were held by Khalid Mishal and the Egyptian president and his prime minister, and nothing has been done up to this moment. It only talks about ceasefire, and people expected that last night they would have reached such a ceasefire. After we heard the speech of Khalid Mishal today, I could say that after his speech, it's not going to be easy to reach a ceasefire in the next 2 days, at least, because he's affirmative that as long as the Israeli side keep firing on the Gaza Strip, Hamas would keep responding.
Right, so you feel it's going to go on. It's going to go on for at least another 48 hours. When we asked the viewers, who would stop the fighting, well, we got a succinct answer on Twitter from Clayton in Seattle, in the United States. His answer, well, it's summed up in one word: God. But he wasn't the only one. Interesting response also from Bruno in Nantes in eastern France. This fight will stop by itself, he says. Neither side has an interest in prolonging it, because both know that the consequences will be even worse. Annette, do you agree with Bruno?
Well, I think, to be honest, I think both main actors in this scenario really don't want to go down the path of a ground operation. It would be a Pyrrhic victory for Israel. And for Hamas, obviously, many innocent lives will be lost on the part of the Palestinian side. It will be a messy situation. There's no such thing as a good or clean exit strategy for any military operation. I mean, the problem in Israel at the moment is as it is at all times, is that the military establishment has enormous say For them, they believe it wasn't so much the red line had been crossed with, millions of or hundreds of thousands of Israelis having to be forced to scurry into shelters, but it was a potshot that Hamas took the weekend before last, and Israeli soldiers on border patrol on the Israeli side of the border who had just uncovered a Hamas tunnel. And that was a red line as far as the country's generals were concerned, because, as you know, given the history of the country, particularly given what we saw in 2006 on the Israeli-Lebanese border, and also again with Gilad Shalit, you don't go there with Israeli generals. So, they probably are very much likely pushing for a sort of a greater offensive as such. But I think, having said that, I do believe that the political establishment don't want to get involved in that sort of messy situation, because it will lead to extraordinary international criticism, which is what we saw last time. And on Hamas' side, I think equally, it's in their interest to try and gain as much leverage as they can before we go past the point of no return. The other thing I just want to say is also I believe that there is a school of thought that it was a strategic error on the part of the Israelis to assassinate the head of the Hamas military wing, Ahmad al-Jabari, primarily because he was the point guy for the Israelis. He was the man that they were going to, and by eliminating him from the equation, well, what do you get in response but a massive escalation in violence?
Your thoughts on that, Dore Gold? Was it a mistake?
No, look, the commander of Hamas, on the one hand, was the person who accompanied our soldier, Gilad Shalit, from a Hamas prison to freedom. But he was also the person who seized Gilad Shalit, along with an al-Qaeda affiliate known as Jaish al-Islam a few years back. But I think there's an elephant in the room no one's talking about, and that's Iran. They are the ones with the interest in escalation. Just a few years back, the head of the Quds Force of the Revolutionary Guards of the Pasdaran sent a message to General David Petraeus, who's been in the news for other reasons. And in that message, he said, "I am Qassem Soleimani. I direct Iranian activities in Iraq, in Lebanon, and in the Gaza Strip." Now, the Hamas has been playing down the Iranian role, but those rockets that are fired at Israel are Iranian rockets. They come through Sudan, they come north into Egypt, under the tunnels, under the Philadelphia route, and go into deployment areas. Now, this is the point I really want to make, because there are many viewers who come from the Arab world. We in Israel see Iran in Syria as a force on the ground that is killing Sunni Arabs on a daily basis, 100, 150, with Hezbollah and with the Syrian army. How can anybody who is a Sunni Arab in the Eastern Mediterranean show any backing of Iran when Iran is involved in mass murder in Syria?
But is it not the case, though, that Hamas has really cut its apron strings with Tehran in recent months? Because, for instance, it was forced to shut its office in Damascus and swing and switch alliances away from that Shiite ruler and very clearly direct all its relationships now towards Sunni nations. And that, as a result, it was other Palestinian militant groups in the Gaza Strip who were much more eager to take money from Iran than Hamas was.
Islamic Jihad is an extension of Iranian intelligence. You're right in sort of basically implying that there are others who have strong connections, but all the weaponry that's being used comes from Iran. The training comes from Iran. And we have the commander of the Quds Force admitting to his involvement in all of this.
Let's look at who's doing the mediating. And Egypt, and a moment ago, Hani al-Bassous mentioning it, the Prime Minister last week photographed cradling the body of a 4-year-old boy on a visit to the Gaza Strip when he toured. At the same time, neither he nor his boss have ever slammed the door on talks since things began to escalate.
There are now intensive efforts through communication channels with the Palestinian side and with the Israeli side. And there are now some indications that there is a possibility of a ceasefire between the two sides soon.
Over the weekend, there was the visit to Cairo of the Turkish Prime Minister, of his Qatari counterpart as well. Qatari counterpart who recently had been to visit, along with the emir, to Qatar. Hani al-Bassous is the best hope for brokering something lasting with the Egyptians, the Turkish government, or with the Qataris?
Well, I think, yes, people in Gaza are eager to have ceasefire and a long-term truce by the mediation of Egypt, mainly by Egypt. And even if anyone would like to interfere and would like to help, that's fine. But I think Egypt now is doing its own best to reach a deal between the two sides. Egypt did not much change its position towards Israel, despite the fact some symbolic gestures were made last few days. I think some ties and some relationship is still between Egypt and Israel, in which some talks is underway now, and I think Egypt would do its best in the next 2 or 3 days at maximum to reach a ceasefire. Now, talks is about a long-term truce. Hamas would like to reach a long-term truce about 5 to 10 years' time at least, and give the chance to people in Gaza to rebuild the infrastructure and to live a decent life and lift the siege, because the siege which was imposed on Gaza in 2007 up to now, one of the main difficulties towards the Palestinian government to help the people to start living a good life. And this was the situation when the Qatar prince came to Gaza, and he went to buy money he paid to the Gaza Strip, $400 million to rebuild the infrastructure. I think Hamas in this way wanted to have some help by the international community, by the Arab leagues and all actors in the region to invest in Gaza, to rebuild the society and to help as much as they can. And they did not have in mind to have such an escalation, and we could witness this really as a fact. For the past 2 or 3 years, Hamas was committed so much and was in control of the Gaza Strip, and even the situation was really, in terms of economic, was getting much better. So now people hoping again, and even Hamas leader want to go back to ceasefire and they want to have a truce, but something can be decent for the Palestinian people. It's not something at the expense of the inhabitants of Gaza who have been living under siege and under difficult situation for the past 5 years. The situation has been really difficult. So you could not find sometimes basic needs for the commodities.
All right. So the will for something lasting, so that Gaza can rebuild. The European Union, by the way, Monday, calling for an immediate ceasefire, with Paris dispatching its foreign minister to Israel, the West Bank, and Egypt. It says it's ready to play facilitator. But here's what's interesting, Annette Young. France does not recognize Hamas and doesn't speak to Hamas directly. So again, when you look at the other people who've been to Cairo over the weekend, most notably Qatar, are they the ones who have to play the mediator if the French want to do some facilitating? Well, it seems a bit complicated.
It always is. That's the problem in that part of the world. You know, there's the public channel versus the behind the closed doors channel of communication, and clearly people are using intermediaries to get their message across. I mean, we know that the Americans are using the Egyptians to, you know, talk to Hamas and as well as other international powers. I mean, it's all part of the, you know, intrigue that is part of daily life in the Middle East.
They say that there's a former French foreign minister, Hubert Védrine, who says diplomacy is about talking to your enemies, not to your friends. Do you regret the fact that none of the Western powers are officially speaking to Hamas?
Well, I think the Western powers laid out conditions for a dialogue back in 2006. You talked about Hamas accepting past agreements between Israel and the Palestinian Authority.
But wouldn't it make life easier if, instead of indirect talks, the way we're all talking about it, there's some people who could sit down through, you know, it's like third or fourth party talks we're talking about here.
Well, you know, you have a fundamental problem here, and it's my job to sometimes say the things that are unpleasant but true. And one of them is that Hamas is regarded by the European Union as an international terrorist organization. And so Hamas has to make a transformation to become a part of the world community. And if you have diplomacy without standards, without saying, you know what, drop terrorism, drop rocket fire, join the world community, if you stop insisting on standards, you get chaos as a result. And it's tough, it's unpleasant having to sometimes be tough, but if you're not, you're going to get a much worse outcome. All
right, let's talk before we go about the United States. If Barack Obama harbors resentment over Benjamin Netanyahu's tacit support for his opponents during the presidential election. He's certainly not showing it. From Southeast Asia, where he's touring, the U.S. president supporting, as he put it, Israel's right to defend itself, all the while talking to the leaders of Egypt and Turkey.
What I've said to President Morsi and Prime Minister Erdogan is that those who champion the cause of the Palestinians should recognize that if we see a further escalation of the situation in Gaza, then the likelihood of us getting back on any kind of peace track that leads to a two-state solution is going to be pushed off way into the future.
A two-state solution, however, we haven't mentioned the Palestinian Authority once in this discussion, Annette Young.
No, but you've noticed today, of course, that we got an agreement of unification between Fatah, which runs the West Bank, and Hamas, of course, who runs Gaza. That is a sense, obviously, Palestinian Brotherhood kicks in at moments like this, and clearly, I mean, people have been arguing, at the end of the day, President Mahmoud Abbas is very much a weak figure. He's losing support by the minute in the West Bank with rising food prices. The fact that many Palestinians there believe that he's a sellout to the Israelis. However, Israel would argue, but that's the sort of concept of what they want. They want a Palestinian political leader who's willing to put down arms and, do what he can to build an infrastructure for a two-state solution. But it just shows you there's still, regardless of this agreement, there's still a lot of anger, a lot of problems in terms of that relationship between Fatah and Hamas, because it was Hamas who seized control in a very bloody coup in 2007. And memories, run long in that part of the world. Fatah people haven't forgotten that. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on that score, and also not to mention the fact that Hamas has trouble in acknowledging and accepting many of the Fatah politicians in the West Bank.
All right, another layer to complicate matters. Let's hope that some kind of a deal is struck soon, that the violence can end on both sides. I want to thank Dore Gold for joining us, Annette Young. I want to thank as well Hani El-Bassous for joining us from the Gaza Strip, and thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.